The grand hall in Paderborn was a cavern of flickering shadows and uneasy quiet, a place where the usual roar of feasting warriors had been replaced by a low, thrumming tension that hung heavier than the smoke from the great fire pit. At the center of it all, a man of immense stature and quiet intensity, King Charles, later to be known as Charlemagne, sat upon a high-backed oak throne, his broad hands resting on its carved arms, his keen, watchful eyes missing no detail in the room. He was a king who had spent a lifetime forging a kingdom from the clash of steel and the force of his own will, yet the proposition laid before him this evening was of a scale and nature that gave even his formidable spirit a moment of profound pause. The men who had brought this offer were not of his world. They were emissaries from the sun-scorched, alien land of Hispania, sent by the rebellious governor of the strategic city of Zaragoza, a man named Charlemagne al-Arabi. These Saracen delegates, clothed in fine, unfamiliar silks that whispered of immense wealth and a sophisticated, distant culture, stood out starkly against the rough-hewn timber and fur-clad Frankish nobles. Their leader had spoken with a polished, persuasive grace, his voice a smooth instrument weaving a vision of glory and conquest that had left the assembled Frankish counts and dukes shifting in their seats, their eyes alight with a dangerous greed. The offer was, on its surface, breathtakingly simple and irresistibly tempting. Charlemagne and other disaffected lords along the volatile frontier of the Emirate of Córdoba were in open revolt against their ruler, the powerful Emir Abd al-Rahman I. They were powerful men, they claimed, commanding cities, fortresses, and armies, but they needed a mighty, external force to tip the balance irrevocably in their favor. They sought an alliance with the great Christian king of the Franks, a legendary warrior whose fame had even reached their ears across the formidable barrier of the Pyrenees Mountains. In return for his military assistance, for the awe-inspiring sight of his vast Frankish host marching into their lands, they promised him nothing less than the submission of all the northeastern territories of Hispania. The great, fortified city of Zaragoza, the jewel of the Ebro Valley, would open its gates to him without a fight. Other cities would follow suit. The land, its wealth, its people, would acknowledge him as their overlord. It was the chance to expand his realm further than any of his predecessors had ever dreamed, to plant his banner in a land of ancient Romans and fierce Moors, to become not just a king of the Franks, but a truly European emperor in the making, a father to a continent united under his cross and his sword. The potential rewards were enough to make any monarch's head spin with visions of eternal glory and unprecedented power. Yet, as Charles listened, his gaze fixed on the eloquent speaker, a cold, sharp sliver of doubt began to work its way beneath the surface of the enticing fantasy. This was a man who had risen to power through constant warfare, cunning diplomacy, and a survival instinct as sharp as a Frankish blade. He had fought Saxons in misty forests, Lombards in Italian passes, and Bavarians in Alpine valleys. He understood the language of ambition and betrayal as fluently as he spoke his native tongue. And something here, in this almost too perfect offer, did not ring true. Why would these powerful Islamic governors, men of pride and station, so readily invite a massive Christian army into their very heartlands? Was their rebellion against Córdoba truly so desperate that they would trade one master for another, and a foreign one at that? The logistics alone were a nightmare to contemplate. To move an army of the size required, thousands of armored cavalry, thousands more of foot soldiers, a vast train of supplies, siege equipment, and camp followers, across the wild, towering, and unforgiving passes of the Pyrenees was a monumental undertaking fraught with peril even without the threat of enemy action. The mountains were their own enemy, a place of sudden storms, narrow paths where a single rock slide could doom an entire column, and ambushes by fierce Basques who owed allegiance to no king. And what awaited them on the other side? Would Zaragoza's gates truly swing open as promised, or would they find themselves staring at high, defiant walls and a hostile garrison? Was this a genuine plea for help, or was it an elaborate trap, a way to lure the most powerful military force in Christendom into a death box between the mountains and a waiting Umayyad army? The emissaries were smooth, their promises glittering, but Charles searched their eyes and saw not the desperate hunger of men seeking salvation, but the cool, calculated assessment of players in a much deeper game. He saw the looks they exchanged amongst themselves, subtle and fleeting. He heard the almost imperceptible hesitation in their voice when asked specific questions about the troop deployments of the emir. The risk was astronomical. The entire seasoned core of his kingdom's military strength could be led into an ambush and annihilated in those foreign mountains, leaving his entire realm, from the Rhine to the Seine, vulnerable and leaderless. It would be the end of everything he had built. But the reward was the stuff of legacy. It was the chance to be remembered not for a generation, but for a millennium. The weight of the decision was a physical pressure on his shoulders. He looked around at his own men, saw the naked ambition on the faces of some of his younger, more impetuous commanders, eager for plunder and fame. He saw the more cautious, weathered faces of his veteran lords, their expressions mirroring his own deep-seated unease. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling up into the dark recesses of the hall. The fate of a continent, though none yet knew it by that name, hung in the balance, suspended in the smoky air between a promise and a probable lie. Charles leaned forward, the oak of the throne creaking under his shift in weight. His voice, when it finally came, was low, measured, and carried the full gravity of a king balancing on the knife's edge of history. "Your words paint a compelling picture," he began, his eyes never leaving those of the Saracen envoy. "A picture of glory and gain. But a king does not march his army on a picture. He marches on certainty. Tell me again. Tell me everything. Leave nothing out. For the price of a mistake here is not merely gold or land. The price is the blood of every man who would follow me." The negotiation, the true test of wills, had only just begun, and every soul in the hall held their breath, understanding that the story of their world was being rewritten in that very moment. The silence that followed the king's command was not merely an absence of sound. It was a thick, suffocating entity that filled the vast hall, pressing down on every man present. From the highest duke to the lowliest serving boy holding a jug of wine, whose hands had begun to tremble so violently the liquid sloshed silently against the vessel's sides. All eyes, Frankish and Saracen alike, were locked onto the face of the emissary, Ibn al-Arabi, who for the first time since his grand entrance seemed to falter. A flicker of something unreadable. Was it fear? Calculation? Annoyance? Passing behind his dark, confident eyes before he masterfully recomposed his features into a mask of respectful solemnity. He bowed his head slightly, not in submission, but as a scholar might before delving into a complex text, buying a precious moment to choose his next words with the care of a man walking across a floor he suddenly suspects might be riddled with traps. "O great king," he began again, his voice softer now, losing its theatrical flourish and adopting a tone of grave confidentiality, as if he were sharing state secrets of the utmost sensitivity, meant for Charles's ears alone, though every soul in the hushed hall strained to catch every whispered syllable. "Your wisdom is as renowned as your strength. You see the board, not just the pieces. So let me speak with the frankness that our situation demands, for the sands in the hourglass of our opportunity are falling swiftly." He stepped closer to the throne, the rich fabrics of his robe whispering against the rushes strewn on the floor. "The certainty you seek, the assurance against betrayal, it lies not in a parchment of oath, for oaths can be burned. It lies in mutual necessity, in a shared enemy whose victory would spell the utter destruction of us all. The Emir in Cordoba, Abd al-Rahman, is not merely a ruler quelling a rebellion. He is a unifier, a man of iron will who seeks to consolidate all of Al-Andalus under his direct, unquestioned control. His armies are vast, his resolve absolute. For my master, Charlemagne, and for myself and the other lords of the Northern March, this is not a play for greater autonomy, it is a fight for survival itself. If he succeeds in crushing us, there will be no more governors in Zaragoza, no more semi-independent power. There will only be the Emir's viceroys, his tax collectors, and his executioners. We are not inviting you into a mere political squabble. We are begging you to step into a war of annihilation." He paused, letting the grim finality of those words sink into the minds of the Frankish nobles, many of whom were now nodding slowly, understanding the brutal simplicity of a fight for survival. "You ask of certainty," Ibn al-Arabi continued, his voice dropping even further, compelling Charles and those nearest to lean in unconsciously. "Consider this, what possible gain could we secure by betraying you? To lure your mighty host across the mountains only to ambush it. To what end? If we were to destroy your army, we would be left bled white, our own forces shattered in the effort, standing amidst the corpses of the only power capable of shielding us from Cordoba's wrath. The emir would arrive not as a savior but as a conqueror to finish the wounded victors. It would be our suicide, not our salvation. Our fate is now irrevocably tied to yours. Your victory is our only path to continued existence. This is the unshakable foundation of our offer. This is your certainty." He then unveiled the final, dazzling layer of his proposal, a move designed to appeal directly to Charles's dual nature as a devout Christian king and a strategic empire builder. "And the victory, great king, will resonate through the ages. You will not merely be gaining territory. You will be liberating ancient Christian lands from the grip of the unbeliever. You will be greeted not as a foreign invader, but as a liberator by the Christian populations who still cling to their faith in the valleys of Navarre and the counties of Catalonia. They pray for a sign, for a deliverer. You can be that sign. The Church in Rome, which you have so stoutly defended, will hail you as its greatest champion, a new Constantine. The treasure of Zaragoza, the riches of the Ebro Valley, will fill your coffers for a generation, funding your great works and your further campaigns to unite all the Christian peoples under your benevolent rule. This is not an invasion, it is a crusade before the word was ever coined, a holy mission that will cement your legacy for 1,000 years." The speech was a masterpiece of persuasive rhetoric, weaving together threads of cold logic, desperate emotion, and spiritual fervor into a tapestry so compelling it seemed to erase doubt. A wave of excited murmuring swept through the Frankish side of the hall. Young warriors, their eyes alight with visions of divine purpose and mountains of gold, gripped the hilts of their swords. Even some of the older, more cautious counts were visibly swayed, the initial suspicion in their eyes replaced by a gleam of avaricious anticipation. The promise of easy plunder and eternal glory was a potent drug. But King Charles remained still as a carved idol, his face an unreadable mask. He had heard the words, acknowledged their power, but his mind was racing far ahead, down the treacherous mountain paths, calculating supply lines, the temper of his men, the moods of the weather, the 1,000 variables that could turn a glorious campaign into a bloody disaster. He saw the fervor in his men's eyes and knew it was a double-edged sword. It would drive them through hell, but it could also make them blind to danger, reckless in the face of the unknown. He knew that the emissary's logic, while sound on the surface, relied on the assumption that his counterparts were rational actors thinking only of survival. What if they were not? What if pride, or a secret deal with Cordoba, or a simple miscalculation altered the equation? His gaze swept over his council, taking in their changed demeanors. He was alone in his skepticism, a solitary rock against the rising tide of enthusiasm. To refuse now would be to seem weak, hesitant, to lose the momentum of his reign and the loyalty of men hungry for glory. The pressure to act, to seize this seemingly God-given opportunity, was immense. Finally, he rose to his full, imposing height, and the hall fell utterly silent once more, all breaths held. "So be it." His voice boomed, not with triumphant joy, but with the grim finality of a man accepting a fateful challenge. "We will march. We will cross the mountains. We will see the truth of your words with our own eyes." A great roar of approval erupted from the Franks, a thunderous wave of sound that shook the very foundations of the hall. Charles let it wash over him, his expression still grave. He held up a hand for silence, which was instantly granted. His eyes, cold and sharp as flint, fixed back on Ibn al-Arabi. "But know this," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet that cut through the lingering echoes of the cheer. "Your certainty is now my certainty. Your survival is now tied to my victory. If this is a trap, if the gates of Zaragoza remain closed to me, you will not live to see the Emir's victory. My wrath will not be on the battlefield. It will be in this hall, upon your return. I will not be the one who is tricked. Do you understand the pact you have made?" The threat hung in the air, naked and brutal. The smile vanished from the emissary's face, replaced by a pale, solemn respect. He bowed deeply, lower this time. "The stakes are clear, Majesty. We have placed our lives, our cities, and our souls in your hands. We will await your arrival with the greatest anticipation." With that, the die was cast. The path was set. The great machine of the Frankish war effort began to grind into motion that very night, as Charles started barking orders to his marshals, orders for the muster of the largest army he had ever assembled, a host of such size that it would stretch for miles along the mountain trails. A river of steel and determined men flowing south towards a destiny that would either make them the fathers of a new Europe, or leave their bones to bleach beneath a foreign sun, their story ending in ignominious ruin. The suspense of the unknown now clung to everyone, a chilling mist that the fervent cheers of the warriors could not completely dispel. The king had chosen his path, but the mountains held their secrets, and the truth of Zaragoz's promise was a ghost that would haunt every step of the long, perilous march south. The decision, once uttered, became a force of nature unto itself, a colossal wave that surged out from the hall in Paderborn and swept across the entire Frankish kingdom with a momentum that was both terrifying and awe-inspiring to behold. For weeks, then months, the very land itself seemed to shudder and groan under the weight of the immense preparation, as the intricate, brutal machinery of early medieval warfare was summoned into existence by the will of its king. From the misty Rhine forests to the rolling fields of Neustria, from the rugged highlands of Austrasia to the subdued Saxon territories still smoldering with resentment, the summons went out, a relentless, unforgiving demand for men, for iron, for grain, for horses, for the countless things needed to sustain a host of such unimaginable scale on a march into the very jaws of the unknown. The air everywhere was filled with the cacophony of industry and mobilization, the constant, rhythmic clang of 1,000 hammers on 1,000 anvils in village forges and great armories, beating out swords, spearheads, and the tough, iron rings of mail hauberks that would form a shimmering, deadly skin around the army's corps of professional fighters. The frantic sawing and planing of wood in great yards as carts and wagons were built or repaired, their wheels banded with iron, to carry the tons of salted meat, hard bread, barley, and ale that would be the lifeblood of the campaign. The plaintive lowing of vast herds of cattle being driven towards central muster points, a moving larder on the hoof. The shrill whinnies of horses as every count, duke, and lord brought forth their contingents of cavalry, the proud, armored heart of Charles's power, their tack jingling, their breath pluming in the increasingly chilly autumn air. Messengers on lathered horses galloped endlessly along the old Roman roads, their pouches stuffed with tightly rolled scrolls bearing precise, detailed orders from the king's strategic mind, orders specifying muster points, routes of march, quantities of supplies to be contributed by each region under pain of severe punishment. This was not a rabble of enthusiastic farmers picking up spears. This was the most sophisticated military organization in the Western world, a lethal instrument honed by decades of annual campaigning, now being sharpened to a razor's edge for its most ambitious strike yet. Charles himself was a whirlwind of relentless energy, a presence that seemed to be everywhere at once, his critical eye missing no detail. He moved from the forge to the granary to the stables, his questions sharp and precise, his praise rare but valued, his wrath swift and terrible for any sign of sloppiness or delay. He personally interviewed scouts who had knowledge of the mountain passes, rugged, weather-beaten men, Basque traders and lone Christian monks who spoke of narrow trails that could crumble under a horse's hoof, of sudden avalanches of rock and snow, of unpredictable bands of Highlanders who sold their loyalty to none. He pored over crude, precious maps scratched on vellum, memorizing the terrifying blank spaces, the places marked only with warnings of Hic sunt dracons, here be dragons. The sheer scale of the logistical challenge was enough to break a lesser man's spirit. He was planning to move an army of over 20,000 men, perhaps even more, a number that in the 8th century was akin to moving a city, across one of the most formidable natural barriers in Europe. Every sack of grain, every arrow, every nail for a horseshoe had to be accounted for, transported, and protected. The weight of it all, the responsibility for every single life in that vast host, was a constant, crushing pressure on his broad shoulders. He slept little, his mind racing through scenarios, contingencies, potential disasters. The smooth promises of Ibn al-Arabi echoed in his memory, but they were now drowned out by the pragmatic screams of real-world preparation. He trusted his own preparations more than any foreigner's vow. He organized the army into a vast, segmented serpent, a formidable vanguard of his most experienced Eastern Franks and Bavarians, tasked with clearing the path and securing the high ground, the immense, slow-moving center, containing the bulk of the infantry, the baggage train, the siege engines disassembled into ponderous loads, and his own royal bodyguard, and a strong, resilient rearguard, composed of hardened warriors from the western regions, whose grim duty would be to hold the narrow mountain passes open for retreat should the unthinkable happen and the army need to extricate itself from disaster. This rearguard was his insurance policy, a silent admission of the deep-seated fear that gnawed at him. As the immense host finally began to coalesce, first in smaller regional musters and then flowing like iron rivers toward the main gathering point near the town of Auxerre, the sight was enough to stir the soul of the most hardened veteran and strike terror into the heart of any onlooker. It was the full, terrifying majesty of Frankish power made manifest. The early morning sun glinted off a forest of spearpoints, a sea of painted shields, each lord's contingent marked by their own distinctive colors and symbols, from the boar of the Ardennes to the eagle of the Rhineland. The air vibrated with the deep, metallic murmur of thousands of men and animals on the move, a sound like distant thunder made by human hands. The proud scarras, the professional corps of armored cavalry, sat astride their powerful destriers, their long mail coats reaching their knees, their heads encased in iron helms, their lances pointing skyward like a barren forest. Alongside them marched the levied infantry, freemen obligated to serve, their equipment more varied but their resolve hardened by the prospect of plunder and the commanding presence of their king. And weaving through it all were the non-combatants, carters, blacksmiths, cooks, priests offering blessings and hearing final confessions, and the inevitable camp followers, a small city of people whose survival was tied to the army's fortunes. The noise was a constant, overwhelming symphony, the jingle of harnesses, the creak of wagon wheels, the beat of drums setting the pace, the shouted orders of officers, the bawdy songs of men trying to quell their own fear with bravado, the lowing of oxen, and the barking of dogs. The smell was just as potent, the sweat of men and beasts, the oiled leather of new gear, the pungent odor of massed humanity, the earthy scent of mud churned up by countless feet and hooves. From Auxerre, this colossal human storm began its slow, inexorable roll southwards, following the old Roman roads toward the looming, purple haze of the Pyrenees on the distant horizon, a natural wall that seemed to grow taller and more forbidding with each passing day. The mood within the army was a complex tapestry of emotions. There was wild excitement, a raw thirst for adventure, and the fabled riches of the South. There was fervent religious zeal, stoked by the priests who walked among them, framing the campaign as a holy war to reclaim land for Christendom. But there was also a deep, creeping anxiety, a primal fear of the unknown mountains ahead and the reputation of the fierce Saracen warriors who waited on the other side, men spoken of in hushed tones as demonic fighters, wielders of curved blades that could slice through Frankish mail, masters of strange, swift horses and tactics of lightning raid and retreat. This fear was a ghost that marched alongside every man, visible in the nervous glances toward the ever-nearing mountains, in the tightened grip on a spear haft, in the silent prayers offered up at night around countless campfires that flickered like a field of stars across the Frankish countryside. And at the center of it all, moving with a calm, imposing authority that was the bedrock of the army's morale, was King Charles. He was everywhere, riding up and down the immense column, his presence a tangible force that steadied nerves and reinforced resolve. He shared the same hard bread and salt meat as his men, drank the same thin beer, and offered a word of encouragement, or a sharp rebuke with equal measure. He was their commander, their king, and in that long, uncertain march toward the clouds, he became their talisman. He masked his own profound doubts, his gnawing suspicion that the promises of Zaragoza were built on sand, behind a facade of unwavering confidence. He knew the truth that every great general knows, that an army is not just a collection of men and weapons, but a fragile thing of spirit and belief, and his role was to be the unshakable keeper of that belief, even as he led them toward a destiny that he himself could not fully foresee. The mountains now stood before them, not a distant haze but a stark, icy reality, their peaks already dusted with the first snows of the approaching season, the passes dark and narrow like wounds in the flesh of the earth. The point of no return was at hand. The great gamble was beginning. The fate of the father of Europe was to be decided not in the warm hall of Paderborn, but in the cold, hard, treacherous stone of those silent, waiting peaks. The Pyrenees did not simply appear on the horizon, they rose like a grim, implacable god, a vast, brooding wall of stone and ice that seemed to swallow the sky itself, dwarfing the immense Frankish host that now clustered at its feet. A mere scattering of ants at the base of a cathedral built by giants. The air, which had carried the gentle warmth of the Frankish plains, now turned sharp and thin, carrying a biting chill that seeped through wool and leather alike, a constant, whispering reminder of the realm of rock and wind they were about to enter. The confident roar of the army dwindled to a hushed, apprehensive murmur as men tilted their heads back, their faces pale with the awe that bordered on terror, to gaze upon the terrifying majesty of the passes, jagged rents in the mountain's flesh, dark, narrow, and treacherous, where the sun seemed reluctant to shine. This was the moment where the grand strategy, the proud musters, the promises of glory, all collided with the brutal, uncaring reality of geography. The wide Roman road they had followed so faithfully for weeks came to an end, dissolving into a chaotic web of goat trails, scree-strewn slopes, and paths that clung to the sides of vertiginous cliffs, paths that seemed designed by nature to defy the passage of anything larger than a solitary traveler. The immense, meticulously organized column of the Frankish war machine now faced its first and perhaps most deadly enemy, the mountain itself. The order to begin the ascent was given not with the triumphant blast of a horn, but with a series of grim, practical commands shouted by hoarse-voiced officers. The vanguard, the hardened Eastern Franks and Bavarians, moved first, their task Herculean in its danger, to secure the narrowest points, to test the stability of rock shelves that threatened to crumble into nothingness, to scout ahead for any sign of ambush, not from Saracen armies, but from the fierce, independent Basque tribesmen who were masters of these heights and who watched the Frankish intrusion with hostile, unseen eyes from their perches among the crags. The sounds of the army changed utterly. The rhythmic tramp of marching feet was replaced by the nervous clatter of hooves on loose stone, the desperate, straining creak of wagons as teams of oxen and men hauled them up impossible inclines, their wheels skidding and slipping, sometimes tipping entire loads of precious supplies, barrels of water, sacks of grain, bundles of arrows, down into the bottomless ravines that yawned beside the trail. The losses accepted with a grim fatalism as the cost of passage. The disassembled siege engines, those symbols of Frankish power, became monstrous, absurd burdens, their massive components requiring 100 men to manhandle them a few painful feet at a time, their progress measured in inches per hour. The air grew thinner still, burning in lungs accustomed to the lowlands, sapping the strength from even the strongest men. The weather, as the scouts had warned, was a capricious demon. One moment the sky could be a brilliant, hard blue, the next a sudden squall would scream down from the peaks, bringing with it a blinding, stinging rain that turned the paths into slick mudslides, or worse, a wet, heavy snow that clung to beards and helmets, numbing fingers and freezing men where they stood. The temperature plummeted as night fell, a cold so profound it felt like a physical assault, and men huddled together for warmth, their campfires pathetic flickers in the vast, overwhelming darkness of the mountains, the howl of the wind sounding like the mocking laughter of spirits. King Charles was no distant commander observing from safety. He was in the thick of the struggle, his own immense physical strength and iron will tested to their absolute limits. He dismounted his great warhorse, leading it by the reins, setting an example by putting his own shoulder to a bogged-down wagon, his shouts of effort mingling with those of the common soldiers. He shared their misery, their cold, their exhaustion. His face, usually a mask of royal composure, was now etched with the same strain and fatigue as the lowliest infantryman, his beard crusted with ice, his eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep and the constant, biting wind. But his presence was a powerful medicine for the army's morale. To see their king, the most powerful man in Christendom, straining in the mud and snow alongside them, refusing any special comfort, was a testament to his character that forged a bond of loyalty stronger than any oath of fealty. He moved constantly along the struggling column, his voice a hoarse but steadying force, offering praise, delivering curt orders to redistribute loads, organizing teams to rescue precious supplies, and always looking ahead, his mind calculating the agonizingly slow rate of advance, the dwindling supplies, the growing number of men lost to falls, exposure, and the sudden, silent arrows of Basque skirmishers that would occasionally whip out of the mist to claim a life before the attackers vanished back into the rock. The promises of Ibn al-Arabi, of open gates and easy victory, must have seemed like a cruel, distant joke in this hellish landscape. Every ounce of energy was spent simply on survival and forward motion. The thought of actually fighting a battle at the end of this ordeal was almost too much to contemplate. Doubt was a contagion more dangerous than the cold, and Charles fought it by sheer force of personality, by showing no trace of it himself. After days that felt like years, the lead elements of the vanguard, a band of grim, frostbitten Bavarians, finally struggled over the highest pass and caught their first glimpse of the land beyond. A weak cheer went up, born more of relief than triumph, and was passed back down the struggling column, giving the exhausted men a final burst of strength. They had done it. They had crossed the Pyrenees. But as the main body of the army began its descent into the foothills of Hispania, the mood was not one of jubilation, but of a weary, watchful caution. They were in the unknown now. The landscape changed, becoming drier, more rugged, colored in shades of ochre and dusty green, a stark contrast to the verdant world they had left behind. Scouts were sent out in every direction, ranging far ahead, their reports returning to the king with increasing frequency and urgency. The news was puzzling, then concerning, and finally, deeply alarming. There were no signs of the promised welcome. No delegations from Salem and Al-Arabi arrived with fresh supplies and guides. The Christian populations they had been told would greet them as liberators were nowhere to be found. The villages they scouted were either empty, their inhabitants fled, or else populated by sullen, fearful people who offered no help and claimed to know nothing. Most ominously of all, the scouts reported that the great city of Zaragoza, their ultimate destination, whose gates were supposed to swing open in joyful submission, was not a city preparing for a peaceful transfer of power. It was a fortress preparing for a siege. The walls were lined with troops, not Frankish allies, but Saracen defenders. The gates were not open, they were barred and reinforced. The banners flying from the towers were not those of a rebellious governor seeking friendship. They were the standards of the Umayyad Emirate of Córdoba. The cold, gnawing suspicion that had lived in King Charles's gut since the meeting in Paderborn now crystallized into a horrifying, ice-cold certainty. They had been betrayed. The entire monumental effort, the suffering of the mountain crossing, the immense expenditure of treasure and hope, it had all been for nothing. Or worse than nothing. For as the full reality of their situation became clear, a second, even more terrifying report came galloping in from the rearguard, now strung out vulnerably through the highest, most difficult passes of the mountain route they had just traversed. The Basques were massing. Not in small, harassing bands, but in significant numbers. And they were not alone. Among them were sighted units of professional cavalry, their armor and banners unmistakably Saracen. The trap that Charles had feared, the one he had tried to guard against with his strong rearguard, was not ahead of them at Zaragoza. It was behind them. It was in the mountains. The army was not marching toward a victory. It was caught in a giant vice, its head resting before the unyielding walls of a hostile city, its long, vulnerable tail stretched out and exposed in the deadly labyrinth of the passes, and the jaws of the trap were beginning to slam shut. The glorious crusade had vanished, replaced by a nightmare of survival. The father of Europe stood at the brink of annihilation. The ice-cold certainty of betrayal that flooded King Charles's veins was not a paralyzing shock, but rather the catalyst that transformed him from a determined campaigner into a figure of pure, terrifying, and calculating survival instinct. In that moment, standing on the arid soil of Hispania with the defiant walls of Zaragoza smirking in the distance, and the specter of a closing trap at his back, every ounce of his decades of experience, every ambush survived, every battlefield reversal turned, every lesson in the brutal algebra of warfare, came to a searing, white-hot focus. The grand vision of empire, the holy crusade, the promises of glory, all of it was instantly stripped away, burned off like morning mist by the sun of a single, stark reality. The preservation of the army was now the only objective. The annihilation of his entire force, the core of his kingdom's strength and the bedrock of his power, was not a possibility. It was an imminent event, a sword already in motion, and his mind began to move with a speed and clarity that would later be etched into legend. He did not rage, he did not despair. He assessed. His eyes, hard and flinty, scanned the terrain, the positioning of his stretched-out columns, the tired faces of his men who were only just beginning to understand the catastrophic shift in their fortunes. The vice he had feared was real. Before him, Zaragoza was a hardened nut he could not crack without a protracted siege for which he had neither the time nor, now, the supplies. Behind him, His lifeline through the mountains was being systematically severed. The rearguard, his insurance policy, was not a shield anymore. It was the part of his body already in the wolf's mouth. His commands began to fly, rapid, precise, and utterly calm, a display of leadership that held the rising panic of the army at bay through sheer force of will. Messengers, their faces pale with the dread news they carried, were dispatched not with cries of alarm, but with tightly controlled, specific orders. The entire immense machine of the army, which had been grinding slowly forward towards a mirage, now had to reverse its momentum and perform a maneuver of breathtaking complexity and danger, a fighting retreat back into the very heart of the death trap, with a determined, prepared enemy holding the high ground. The first and most critical order was to the rearguard itself, now under the command of the most trusted and gritty of his lords, a grizzled veteran named Roland, who commanded the march of Brittany. The order was not to try and hold the impossible entirety of the mountain pass. It was to form a series of choking points, to create a sacrificial anode, to sell their lives as dearly as possible in a series of delaying actions, to turn narrow defile and stone bridges into killing zones that would slow the advancing Basque and Saracen force down, buying precious hours, then minutes, for the main body of the army to disengage from the Zaragoza front and begin its desperate retrograde movement. This was a death sentence for the rearguard, and Charles knew it. The message carried the full weight of that grim necessity, a king's most terrible command, to die, so that others might live. The main force, meanwhile, began its frantic about-face. The siege engines that had been hauled with such agony over the mountains were now the first things abandoned, their timbers shattered and burned to prevent any use by the enemy. The vast baggage train was ruthlessly streamlined. Non-essential loot, heavy treasures, anything that would slow the desperate sprint for survival was jettisoned. What remained was organized not for comfort, but for speed and defense. The cavalry, the pride of the army, was repositioned from vanguard to a protective screen around the flanks and rear of the new column, which now had its head where its tail had been, a serpent trying to retreat back into its own narrow burrow while being attacked from all sides. The atmosphere curdled from confident invasion to grim evacuation. The cheers of holy war were replaced by the grim silence of men who know they are fighting for their lives, the air thick with the smell of fear, sweat, and the smoke of their own burning supplies. As the army began its frantic push back towards the mountains, the first sounds of battle from the rearguard reached them, not the full-throated roar of a set-piece battle, but the distant, sharp, and deadly clashes of intense, small-scale engagements. The scream of horses, the clash of steel on steel echoing weirdly through the stone canyons. The desperate shouts of Frankish captains holding a line against a foe that knew the land and fought with a ferocious intimacy. Each distant echo was a heartbeat closer to the main force, a grim metronome counting down the time they had left. Charles, now at the head of the retreat, which was now the front line of the escape, pushed the column mercilessly. There was no time for rest, no time for proper burial of the fallen who succumbed to exhaustion, or the arrows that now began to flicker down from the high ridges as the pursuing enemy scouts found their range. The ascent back into the mountains, which had been a trial on the way south, became a hellish nightmare on the way north. The paths were now slick with blood as well as mud. The narrow passes, which had been difficult to traverse, became perfect ambush sites. Basque and Saracen skirmishers, light-footed and agile, harried the flanks of the column constantly, appearing from behind rocks to loose a volley of arrows or roll a boulder down onto the packed ranks below before melting back into the landscape. The Frankish army was like a great, wounded bear, too powerful to be killed instantly by the swarming wolves, but being bled dry by 1,000 cuts, its strength ebbing away with every mile of the tortured retreat. And then, as the head of the column fought its way back into the highest, most constricted part of the route, a place of deep shadows and echoing winds, the sounds from the rear changed. The sporadic clashes fell silent. An eerie, ominous quiet descended, broken only by the wind and the labored breathing of the army. It was a silence more terrifying than the noise of battle. It could mean only one thing: the rearguard's delaying action was over. They had been overcome. The path behind them was now completely in enemy hands, and the full force of the pursuers, Basques hungry for plunder and Saracen professionals intent on complete annihilation, would now be driving forward, fresh and unopposed, into the vulnerable rear of the main column. The crisis was now absolute. The army was at its most vulnerable, strung out through the worst terrain, exhausted, demoralized, and with the noose tightening. It was here, in this moment of supreme peril, that the legend was forged. Charles, understanding that a pure flight was now impossible, that they would be run down and slaughtered like cattle in the Narrows, made a second, brilliant, and desperate decision. He would not just run. He would turn and fight. But not a grand battle. An ambush of his own. He identified a point in the pass where the trail widened slightly, a rocky bowl surrounded by high ridges. A place where his pursuers, confident in their chase, would naturally bunch up as they poured into the space. He quickly concealed a strong force of his best remaining cavalry and infantry on the high ground overlooking this bowl, a final reserve of freshish troops he had held back for just such a moment. The rest of the army was ordered to continue its retreat, drawing the enemy in. The trap was simple, brutal, and born of sheer tactical genius. As the pursuing force, a mixed mob of Basques and the vanguard of the Saracen army, surged into the rocky bowl, exhilarated by the chase, believing they were about to fall upon the panicked rear of the Franks, the world exploded. With a great blast of trumpets that echoed like the wrath of God in the confined space, Charles's hidden force revealed itself. Rocks, logs, and a storm of Frankish javelins and arrows rained down from the heights onto the packed mass below. Then, with a roar that shook the very mountains, the Frankish cavalry, led by Charles himself, charged down the slopes into the chaos they had created. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. The pursuers, caught completely by surprise, packed tightly together, and disorganized by their own momentum, were cut to pieces. The shock of the counterattack was so total, so violent, and so unexpected that it shattered the will of the entire pursuing force. The attack broke off. The Battle of Roncesvalles Pass, a name that would echo through history and song and story, was a brutal, bloody rearguard action that saved an army from destruction. It was a catastrophic defeat turned into a managed disaster, a retreat saved by a king's iron nerve and a willingness to make the hardest choices. The cost had been immense. The entire rearguard was lost, including the brave Roland, and the dream of Hispania was dead. But the army, bloodied and humiliated, lived to fight another day. The long, sorrowful march home began, not as conquerors, but as survivors, their king now bearing a new, harder wisdom, and a burning, silent vow of vengeance that would shape the destiny of Europe. The long, sorrowful march home from the Pyrenees was a funeral procession for a dream, a somber, exhausting trudge through the very same landscapes that had, mere weeks before, witnessed the arrogant passage of a seemingly invincible host. The army that now stumbled northwards was a ghost of its former self, a ragged, bloodied, and broken column that moved in a shroud of silence so profound it was more deafening than the previous cacophony of their advance. The air, once thick with the boastful songs of warriors and the confident jingle of harnesses, now carried only the low moans of the wounded, the weary shuffle of countless feet on the dusty road, the creak of carts overloaded with broken men instead of plunder, and the oppressive, suffocating weight of a shame so deep it felt like a physical burden on every man's shoulders. The glorious banners that had flown so proudly were now tattered, stained with mud and blood, and hung limp against their poles as if ashamed to be seen. The faces of the men were hollowed out by exhaustion, etched with the trauma of their narrow escape, their eyes vacant or downcast, unable to meet the gaze of their comrades, or the few terrified villagers who peered out from their huts as this vision of defeat passed by. They were not heroes returning from a crusade. They were survivors fleeing a catastrophe, and the knowledge of the comrades they had left behind, the magnificent, sacrificed rearguard, the flower of Frankish chivalry swallowed by the dark mountains, was a fresh wound that bled with every step. The charisma of King Charles, which had been the brilliant sun around which this entire expedition had orbited, now seemed to have been eclipsed by the failure. He rode at the head of this dismal parade, but his posture was not that of a triumphant general. It was the rigid, iron bearing of a man containing a volcano of rage, grief, and cold, calculating fury within himself. His face was a stone mask, betraying nothing of the tempest inside, but his eyes, those flinty, perceptive eyes, burned with a new, terrifying light, a light of absolute, unforgiving resolve. The practicalities of the return were a nightmare that mirrored the emotional desolation. The carefully stockpiled supply depots established on the march south were now lifelines, but each one reached was a reminder of the ambitious plan that had necessitated them, a plan now lying in ashes. Foraging parties had to be sent out in strength, for the land, which had seemed to promise bounty, now felt hostile, and the threat of lingering Saracen cavalry or vengeful Basque bands was ever present. The wounded required constant attention, and the slow pace dictated by their suffering was a torture for the healthy, who longed only to put the accursed mountains far behind them. Disease, the camp follower of every defeated army, began to stalk the column, its grip tightening on men whose spirits and bodies were already broken. Yet, through it all, Charles's leadership did not falter, it merely changed its character. He was no longer the inspiring figurehead promising glory. He was the stern, unyielding patriarch shepherding his battered flock home. He enforced discipline with a terrifying new severity. Any sign of looting from the Frankish countryside they now passed through was punished instantly and brutally. These were his people, and they would not suffer further from his failure. He personally oversaw the distribution of the dwindling food supplies, ensuring the wounded got their share. He spent hours each day moving through the column, not with words of empty encouragement, but with a silent, solid presence that communicated one undeniable fact: he was still there. He had not abandoned them. He was sharing their misery, their defeat, their shame. And in that shared suffering, a new, different kind of bond was forged, not of triumphant loyalty, but of a hardened, veteran's respect that had stared into the abyss together and somehow, by his will, climbed back out. When the spires of the royal palace at Paderborn finally appeared on the horizon, a sight that should have sparked cheers of relief, it instead caused a fresh wave of dread to wash over the army. They were returning to the very place where the grand ambition had been born, and they were returning with nothing but tales of loss. How would the court, the families, the kingdom react? The news of the disaster, carried by swift riders days ahead of the main column, had already fallen like a pall over the realm. The atmosphere in the capital was one of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into anxiety and murmuring fear. The assembled nobles and churchmen who gathered to witness the return did so not with celebration, but with the grim curiosity of onlookers at a tragedy. As the battered remnants of the army filed into the city, a silence fell over the crowds, a silence of pity, of horror, and for some, of dawning criticism. The king's brothers, who had opposed the venture, watched with grim satisfaction. Rival lords saw weakness where there had once been unassailable strength. The air was thick with unasked questions. How could the great Charles have been so deceived? Had God withdrawn his favor? Was the kingdom now vulnerable? Charles dismounted in the main courtyard, his armor still caked with the dust and gore of the retreat. He did not address the crowd. He did not offer excuses. He did not even go to his chambers to rest. He walked directly into the great hall, his spurs ringing on the stone floor with a final, grim sound, and he summoned his entire council, his face like thunder. The doors closed, shutting out the world. Inside, under the same tapestries that had witnessed the Saracens' honeyed words, a very different king now stood. The grief and exhaustion were still there, buried deep, but what rose to the surface was an incandescent, cold fury. He spoke not of defeat, but of betrayal. Not of failure, but of lesson learned. He detailed the treachery of the Saracen lords, the duplicity of Ibn al-Arabi, not as a lament, but as a case study for the council, a foundational text for a new, uncompromising foreign policy. They thought to break us. His voice was low, but it vibrated with a power that shook the very timbers of the hall. They thought to lure the heart of Christendom into the mountains and destroy it. They have shown us their true nature, and they have made a fatal error. They did not break us. They forged us. They showed us that our world is not one of easy alliances with those who do not share our God. It is a world of iron, and from this day forward we will speak to it only in the language it understands, the language of strength, of certainty, of Frankish iron. This was not the end of an ambition, it was a brutal, painful refining of it. The dream of a quick, glorious expansion south was dead. In its place was born a harder, more pragmatic, and ultimately more enduring vision, the consolidation of a Christian fortress, a realm so unified, so powerful, so internally strong that no external enemy could ever threaten it again. The focus would turn inward and northward, to the final subjugation of the Saxons, to the meticulous organization of his vast territories under a unified legal and ecclesiastical framework. The court poet who would later craft the epic Song of Roland would transform the bloody disaster in the past into a myth of heroic sacrifice, a tale of noble knights holding fast against impossible odds, a foundational story for a new European identity centered around Frankish courage and Christian faith. But the real Charles, the statesman who emerged from the hall that day, was not the romantic hero of song. He was something more formidable, a realist of unparalleled determination. The father of Europe was not born in the moment of his greatest military victory. He was forged in the fire of his most devastating defeat, tempered by the lesson that true power lies not in reckless expansion, but in resilient, unbreakable unity. The retreat from Hispania was over. The long, systematic, and world-changing work of building Christendom had truly begun. The silent vow of vengeance taken on the road home would not express itself in another rash invasion south, but in the creation of an empire so robust that it would shape the continent for 1,000 years. The echo of Roland's horn in the past had not signaled an ending. It had sounded the beginning of a new, harder, and more purposeful chapter. The silence that descended upon the Frankish kingdom in the wake of the retreat from Hispania was not the silence of peace, but the ominous, heavy quiet of a great beast licking its wounds and gathering its strength for a reckoning of unimaginable scale. The court at Paderborn, and indeed the entire realm, became a crucible where the raw, shaming pain of defeat was being smelted in the white-hot fires of King Charles's relentless will, emerging not as a brittle thing of shame, but as a hardened, tempered instrument of a new and terrifying purpose. The king himself became a figure of almost supernatural intensity, a man who seemed to require no sleep, no comfort, his entire being focused with laser precision on a single, all-consuming objective: the absolute and irrevocable consolidation of his power, the creation of a realm so unified, so disciplined, so impregnably strong from within that no betrayal, no external threat, no force of man or nature could ever shake its foundations again. The dream of easy southern expansion was dead, but in its place arose a vision far more profound and enduring: the systematic forging of a continental empire, a Christianitas under Frankish leadership, built not on the shifting sands of Saracen promises, but on the unyielding bedrock of law, faith, and iron. This was the birth pang of Europe, and its midwife was a king whose patience had been incinerated in the Pyrenean passes, leaving only a core of cold, pragmatic fury. The transformation began immediately and was felt in every corner of the kingdom with the force of a permanent revolution. The Great Hall, once a place of feasting and foreign intrigue, was now a command center, its floors covered not with rushes but with maps, architectural plans, and lists, endless, meticulous lists of men, materials, obligations, and projects. Charles's famous energy, once directed outward on campaign, was now turned inward with terrifying efficiency. He became a perpetual motion machine of governance, his court constantly on the move in a grand circuit of his domains, not to display majesty, but to inspect, to audit, to enforce, and to root out any lingering weakness or disloyalty with his own eyes. He moved from county to county, duchy to duchy, with a vast train of notaries, judges, engineers, and bishops, and wherever he went, a whirlwind of reform followed. His missi dominici, the envoys of the Lord, were no longer just messengers. They were his eyes and ears, powerful teams of account, and a bishop sent out in pairs to every province with sweeping powers to audit local officials, administer justice, enforce new laws, and report directly back to him on any sign of corruption, inefficiency, or dissent. They carried with them the updated legal codes he was constantly refining, the capitularies, a vast body of law that standardized everything from weights and measures to court procedures, from military service requirements to the obligations of serfs, creating a unified legal framework that bound his incredibly diverse empire together with the force of written decree. The military, the instrument that had so nearly been broken, was completely reforged. The lesson of the Pyrenees was that a vast host was useless if it was logistically vulnerable and strategically naive. Charles instituted a new system of mobilization based on a highly detailed assessment of landholdings. Every landowner, from the greatest duke to the smallest free farmer, now had a precisely defined obligation based on the value of his property, to provide a fully equipped armored horseman, or several horsemen, or a number of foot soldiers, or to contribute to the building and maintenance of bridges, roads, and fortified strongholds, burghs, along the empire's vulnerable frontiers. This was not a call to arms for glory. It was a cold, calculated system of national defense, a perpetual war machine that could be activated with breathtaking speed and efficiency. The construction of these border burghs became an obsession, a physical manifestation of his new defensive mindset. Along the Saxon frontier, along the Pyrenees, along the Breton March, and along the Mediterranean coast against the lingering Saracen threat, a line of formidable stone fortresses began to rise, each one a garrisoned, self-sufficient community that served as a shield for the heartland, a clear message that the age of expansion was over, and the age of consolidation had begun. The army itself drilled relentlessly, not just in individual combat, but in complex maneuvers, siegecraft, and the brutal discipline of fighting in tight, shield wall formations that could withstand the charge of any enemy. But Charles knew that an empire could not be held together by law and steel alone. It required a soul, a unifying spirit. And that spirit would be Christianity. The defeat in Hispania was systematically reframed not as a military failure, but as a divine punishment for the sin of trusting unbelievers and a test of Frankish faith. The Church, which had always been his ally, was now fully integrated into the machinery of the state, becoming the essential tool for cultural and ideological unification. Bishops were given vast temporal powers alongside their spiritual duties, acting as administrators, judges, and royal agents. The great project of correcting and standardizing the Latin texts of the Bible and the liturgy was undertaken with renewed vigor, creating a unified religious practice across the realm. Most significantly, the conversion of the Saxons, a long, bloody, and intermittent conflict, was now pursued with a new, terrifying finality. The Saxon wars were no longer just about territorial control. They were a Drang nach Osten, a drive to the east that was a crusade in all but name. The choice offered to the Saxon pagans was brutally simple: baptism and submission to Frankish rule, or annihilation. The campaign was merciless, its violence shocking even for the time, but it was pursued with the same systematic efficiency as his legal and military reforms. It was the application of the lesson of Zaragoza. There could be no compromise with those outside the fold. The universe was divided into two camps: the Christian Frankish world, and the chaos beyond. His mission was to expand the former, and wall it off from the latter. The man who had returned from the mountains was not just a king, he was the architect of a new world order, a ruler who understood that true power was not just about winning battles, but about building a civilization so resilient, so coherent, and so convinced of its own divine purpose that it could withstand any shock. The echo of Roland's horn had not faded. It had been transmuted into the ringing of hammers on stone at 1,000 construction sites, the chanting of priests in a newly standardized Latin Mass, the scratch of pens on parchment as laws were copied and disseminated, and the steady, grim tramp of the most professional army the world had seen since the fall of Rome, marching not for plunder, but to secure a permanent peace under the absolute authority of a king who had learned, in the most brutal way possible, that trust was a weakness, and strength was the only currency that mattered. The father of Europe was not celebrating a victory, he was building a fortress for the soul of a continent. The silence that fell over the Frankish kingdom after the failed campaign in Hispania was not a peaceful one. It was a dangerous, heavy quiet, like a massive injured animal hiding away to heal its injuries and gather its strength for a payback that would be huge and terrifying. The king's court at Paderborn, and really the entire Frankish realm, became like a furnace where the raw, humiliating sting of losing was being melted down and reshaped by the blazing, determined will of King Charles. This process did not create something weak and ashamed, but instead a hardened, sharp tool for a new and frightening goal. The king himself became a man of almost unbelievable focus, a person who seemed to need no rest or relaxation, his entire existence aimed like a laser at one single, all-consuming purpose: the complete and unshakable strengthening of his power, the building of a kingdom so united, so well-ordered, and so strong from the inside that no act of betrayal, no outside enemy, no power of man or nature could ever break it again. The dream of quickly expanding his empire south into easy lands was over, but from its ashes rose a much deeper and more lasting vision: the careful, step-by-step creation of a continental empire, a unified Christian world under Frankish command, built not on the unreliable promises of Saracen allies but on the solid, unmovable foundation of law, faith, and iron. This was the painful beginning of what would become Europe, and the person who brought it into the world was a king whose patience had been completely burned away in the mountain passes of the Pyrenees, leaving behind only a heart of cold, practical fury. This great change started right away and was felt everywhere in the kingdom like a permanent and total revolution. The great hall of the palace, once used for feasts and meetings with foreign ambassadors, was now a military command center, its floor covered not in straw but in maps, building plans, and lists, countless, extremely detailed lists of men, supplies, duties, and projects. Charles's famous boundless energy, which he had always used on military campaigns outside his borders, was now focused inward on governing with frightening effectiveness. He became a perpetual motion machine of administration, his court always traveling in a large loop around his lands, not to show off his royal power, but to personally inspect, check accounts, enforce his rules, and find and remove any remaining weakness or disloyalty. He traveled from county to county, duchy to duchy, followed by a huge crowd of secretaries, judges, builders, and bishops, and everywhere he went, a storm of new changes and reforms followed him. His missi dominici, the king's messengers, were not just couriers anymore. They were his eyes and ears, powerful teams made of one high-ranking noble and one bishop sent to every region with total authority to check on local rulers, hold court and give legal judgments, enforce new laws, and report directly back to the king on any sign of corruption, laziness, or rebellion. They carried with them the updated legal codes he was always improving, the capitularies, a huge collection of laws that made everything the same across the empire, from how to measure things to how to run a court, from how many soldiers a landowner had to provide to the duties of peasants, creating a single legal system that tied his very diverse empire together with the power of the written law. The army, the tool that had almost been destroyed in the Pyrenees, was completely rebuilt from the ground up. The lesson from the mountains was that a huge army was worthless if it was weak in its supplies and naive in its strategy. Charles created a new system for calling up soldiers based on a very detailed record of who owned what land. Every landowner, from the most powerful duke to the poorest free farmer, now had an exactly defined duty based on how valuable his property was, to provide one fully equipped armored horseman, or several horsemen, or a number of foot soldiers, or to help pay for and maintain bridges, roads, and fortified forts called burghs along the empire's dangerous borders. This was not a call to fight for fame and treasure. It was a cold, practical system for national defense, a constant war machine that could be started up with amazing speed and order. The building of these border burghs became a total obsession for Charles, a physical symbol of his new defensive way of thinking. Along the border with Saxony, along the Pyrenees, along the border with Brittany, and along the Mediterranean coast against the remaining Saracen threat, a line of powerful stone forts began to be built, each one a manned, independent community that acted as a protective wall for the safer inner lands, a clear signal that the time of adding new land was finished. And the time of securing and strengthening what he already had was now beginning. The army itself trained without stopping, not just in how to fight one-on-one, but in complicated battlefield movements, how to attack castles, and the harsh discipline of fighting in tight, shield wall formations that could stop the charge of any enemy. But Charles understood that an empire could not be held together only by laws and weapons. It needed a spirit, a unifying belief. And that belief would be Christianity. The loss in Hispania was deliberately explained not as a military mistake, but as a punishment from God for the sin of trusting non-believers and a test of the Franks' faith. The Church, which had always been his partner, was now made a central part of the government's machinery, becoming the most important tool for unifying the culture and the ideas of everyone. Bishops were given great political power to go with their religious roles, acting as governors, judges, and representatives of the king. The huge project of fixing and standardizing the Latin texts of the Bible and the worship services was done with new energy, creating a single way of practicing religion across the whole realm. Most importantly, the forced conversion of the Saxons, a long, violent, and on-and-off struggle, was now followed with a new, frightening determination. The Saxon wars were no longer just about taking land. They were a drang knock Austin, a push to the east that was a holy war in everything but name. The choice given to the Saxon pagans was brutally simple: accept baptism and submit to Frankish rule, or be wiped out. The campaign was ruthless, its cruelty shocking even for those harsh times, but it was carried out with the same organized efficiency as his legal and military changes. It was the practical use of the lesson learned at Zaragoza. There could be no deals made with those who were outside the group. The world was split into two sides: the Christian Frankish world, and the disorder and evil outside of it. His mission was to make the former bigger, and to protect it from the latter with walls. The man who had come back from the mountains was not just a king, he was the designer of a new way for the world to be, a ruler who knew that real power was not just about winning fights, but about building a civilization so tough, so consistent, and so sure of its own God-given right to exist that it could survive any disaster. The sound of Roland's horn had not disappeared. It had been changed into the noise of hammers hitting stone at 1,000 building sites, the sound of priests singing in a newly standardized Latin Mass, the scratching of pens on parchment as laws were written and spread everywhere, and the steady, serious marching of the most professional army the world had seen since the fall of Rome, walking not to steal from others, but to protect a permanent peace under the total control of a king who had learned, in the most painful way possible, that trust was a flaw, and strength was the only thing that truly mattered. The father of Europe was not celebrating a single battle victory. He was constructing a fortress for the very soul of a continent, and this work of building and unifying, of forcing order upon chaos, would define the next decades of his reign, leading directly to the event that would forever cement his title as emperor and the founder of a European identity. A single moment of triumph that was built upon this foundation of relentless, pragmatic, and often brutal effort, a moment that would come not in the warm south where he had faced betrayal, but in the cold, hard north against a different old enemy, a final showdown that would answer the question of who would rule the heart of this new Europe he was forging with his own two hands. This relentless, grinding work of nation-building, this daily exertion of will upon a sprawling and reluctant collection of tribes, did not culminate in a single, swift, glorious campaign, but rather in a long, bitter winter of sustained pressure. The Saxons, under their leader Widukind, were a foe unlike any other, a people who fought not for land or treasure alone, but for their very gods and way of life, a way of life that was the direct opposite of the ordered, Latin, Christian world Charles was imposing. They would submit when the Frankish army was present, accepting baptism to avoid slaughter, only to rise again the moment Charles's back was turned, burning the churches, killing the priests, and returning to their ancient customs with a defiance that seemed to feed on the very harshness of the Frankish response. This cyclical rebellion was the greatest threat to Charles's grand design, a persistent flaw in the foundation of his new empire, a drain on its resources and a challenge to its claimed divine favor. The lesson of the Pyrenees, that half-measures and unreliable alliances lead to disaster, now applied to the Saxon forests. There could be no peace through negotiation, only through absolute, undeniable, and permanent subjugation. The year 782 became a turning point, a moment of horrific clarity. After a Frankish force was ambushed and destroyed in the Suntal Hills, Charles's response was not merely a military counterattack. It was an act of terrifying symbolic violence meant to sear the reality of his power into the Saxon consciousness forever. At Verdun on the banks of the Aller River, he ordered the execution of 4,500 Saxon prisoners, a mass beheading that echoed through the annals of history not as a battle, but as a slaughter. This was not the act of the king who had trusted the Saracens of Zaragoza. This was the act of the architect of a new order, for whom mercy to those who rejected that order was a dangerous luxury. The bloodbath of Verdun was a calculated message, written in the starkest terms possible. Resistance was not just futile, it was extinctive. The event shocked Christendom, and even some among Charles's own court were uneasy, but it broke the back of the major Saxon resistance. Widukind, seeing the futility of open warfare against such a force, finally submitted and was baptized in 785, with Charles himself acting as his godfather, a masterstroke of political theater that symbolized the Saxon chieftain's incorporation into the Frankish world. But Charles knew that violence alone could not build his fortress. It could only clear the ground. Upon the ground cleared by Verdun, he began a second, even more profound campaign of integration, the Capitulatio de Partibus Saxoniae, a law code for Saxony so severe and comprehensive it aimed to erase Saxon identity itself. Under these laws, practicing pagan rituals, cremating the dead instead of burying them, or even expressing hostility towards the church were all capital offenses. It was a program of cultural and religious imperialism on a scale rarely attempted, designed to forcibly drag the Saxon people into the Frankish Christian universe he was building. Alongside this legal terror, he initiated a massive project of forced population transfer, moving thousands of Saxons into the heart of Frankish territory and settling Franks in Saxon lands, breaking the tribal bonds that fueled rebellion and mixing the peoples into a single, more manageable whole. The Church followed this physical and legal conquest, with new bishoprics established at key points like Bremen, Munster, and Paderborn itself, becoming not just spiritual centers but fortified nodes of Frankish administrative control, their bells a constant auditory reminder of the new order. For years, this work continued, a tedious, expensive, and often brutal process of pacification and integration that stretched the resources of the kingdom to their limit. There were smaller revolts, constant low-level resistance, and the immense logistical challenge of governing such a vast and newly acquired territory. Yet Charles persevered, his will unwavering, his vision of a unified block of territory from the Pyrenees to the Elbe River never dimming. He was building something that had not been seen in the West since the Romans, a truly continental power. And it was this very achievement, this demonstration of sheer, unstoppable power and organizational genius, that finally drew the attention and the appeal of a new actor onto the stage, an actor from the very heart of the old Roman world. In 799, Pope Leo III, the Bishop of Rome, was attacked in the street by his political enemies in the city, brutally assaulted and left for dead. He fled across the Alps, a supplicant in a world where the ancient authority of the papacy was a ghost compared to the solid, tangible power of the Frankish king. He came to Charles at Paderborn, the very place where the king had licked his wounds and planned his new world after the Hispanic disaster, not just for protection, but for legitimacy, for the power to restore him to his throne and secure his position. This was the moment everything had been building towards. The fortress Charles had built was now so strong that its walls cast a shadow all the way to Rome. The man who had been refining his power for 2 decades, who had replaced the dream of southern expansion with the reality of northern consolidation, now found the ultimate prize, the symbol of transcendent authority, being offered to him not through conquest, but through desperate need. Charles, the ultimate pragmatist, understood the opportunity instantly. Protecting the Pope was not just a religious duty, it was the key to unlocking a new level of authority, one that would transcend his title of King of the Franks and Lombards and place him on a par with the ancient Christian emperors. He sent Leo back to Rome under Frankish guard and, later that year, decided to travel to Rome himself. In the autumn of 800, Charles marched into Italy not as a conqueror, but as a restorer of order, the dominant power in the West answering the call of its spiritual heart. He presided over a council that cleared Leo III of the charges against him, effectively making the Pope answerable to Frankish justice. The stage was now set. On Christmas Day, in the year 800, in the great Basilica of St. Peter's, as Charles rose from prayer before the tomb of the Apostle, Pope Leo III placed the golden crown upon his head, and the crowd in the church, doubtless prearranged by Charles's and Leo's supporters, robbed forth with the acclamation. To Charles Augustus, crowned by God, the great and peace-bringing Emperor of the Romans, life and victory. This was not a coronation in the sense of a pope granting power to a king. It was a symbolic recognition of a power that already existed. The crown was the final piece of architecture on the fortress he had built. It gave a name to what he had created, an empire. It provided a divine sanction for his life's work, tying his relentless drive for unity and order directly to God's will. It transformed the Frankish kingdom into the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would shape European history for 1,000 years. He was no longer just Charles, King of the Franks. He was Carolus Augustus, Emperor. The pain of Roncesvalles, the grim work of Verdun, the endless capitularies, the marching Missy, the fortified burghs, every hammer strike, every law written, every battle fought, had all been leading to this moment. The father of Europe had not been made by a single battle, but by the relentless, daily battle to build, organize, and unify. The battle that truly made Charlemagne the father of Europe was not fought in a day on a single field. It was fought every day for 30 years across a continent, and it was won not with a single sword stroke, but with the unbreakable will of a king who understood that true legacy is not written in sand by the point of a spear, but carved into the stone of institutions, laws, and faith. An enduring foundation upon which a new civilization could rise from the ashes of the old Roman world. The fortress was complete, and its name was Christendom. The imperial crown placed upon Charlemagne's head in St. Peter's Basilica was not an end, but a new and even more demanding beginning. It was the symbolic keystone inserted into the vast arch of his life's work, locking everything into place and transforming its meaning, but also bearing the immense weight of a new, universal responsibility. He returned from Rome not as a king who had received a great honor, but as an emperor who now had to invent what that meant, to pour concrete substance into a title that had been dormant in the West for over 3 centuries. The Christmas Day coronation was the ultimate validation of his philosophy, forged in the bitterness of the Pyrenees, that internal strength and order inevitably attract external recognition and legitimacy. The Pope had not created his power. He had merely given a name to the colossal, unignorable fact of it. Yet, with that name came a cosmic job description: to be the temporal defender of the entire faith, the sword and shield of a unified Christendom. This did not change his methods, which remained those of the pragmatic architect, but it dramatically expanded the canvas upon which he worked and deepened the ideological foundation of his actions. Every law, every military campaign, every educational reform was now viewed through the lens of his imperial dignity, as a necessary action for the maintenance and perfection of this new Roman Empire he was willfully resurrecting. The immediate effect was a fresh wave of meticulous, systematizing energy that swept through the palace and the realm. The court, which was always traveling, now became something more than a royal household. It evolved into the central processing unit of an empire, a mobile capital of experts. Around Charlemagne gathered the most brilliant minds of the age, irrespective of their origin: scholars from Italy like the grammarian Peter of Pisa, theologians from Spain like Theodulf of Orleans, and most famously, the greatest intellectual luminary from England, Alcuin of York. This gathering of talent, often called the Carolingian Renaissance, was not a mere flowering of art for art's sake. It was a crucial part of the state-building project, a cultural and intellectual arm of his consolidation policy. Charlemagne understood that a unified empire required a unified language of administration, religion, and thought. The project to correct and standardize the Latin Bible and liturgical texts was intensified, for a common faith required a common prayer book. Scribes at the palace scriptorium were set to work copying ancient Roman texts and creating new, highly legible manuscripts using a new standardized script known as Carolingian minuscule, with clear lowercase letters and punctuation, which dramatically improved literacy and the accuracy of communication across vast distances. This was a revolution in information technology, ensuring that a decree written in Aachen would be read and understood exactly the same way in Barcelona, Rome, or Mainz. Education was ordered to be provided for boys in monastic and cathedral schools across the realm, not to create a nation of scholars, but to produce a competent class of administrators, priests, and judges who could run the empire according to his unified vision. Even the architecture of his new permanent capital at Aachen was a deliberate statement of imperial renewal. His palace chapel, a stunning masterpiece of engineering and design, was a conscious echo of the great churches of the Eastern Roman Empire in Constantinople, a bold declaration that a new Rome had risen in the West, with a new Christian emperor at its helm. Militarily, the imperial title provided a new justification for the relentless expansion and security that had always been his practice. The wars along the frontiers did not cease. They gained a new layer of ideological purpose as missions to pacify and Christianize those who lay outside the imperial borders. To the north, the Saxons, though broken, required constant vigilance and further campaigns to finally integrate their entire territory, a process that dragged on for years until their land was fully partitioned into Frankish counties and bishoprics, becoming not a conquered enemy but a core part of the empire itself. To the southeast, he turned his attention to the Avars, a nomadic people who had built a vast fortified ring, the Ring, in the Danube Valley, hoarding centuries of plunder from their raids on the Byzantine Empire. The campaign against them was portrayed not just as a border raid, but as an imperial crusade to crush a pagan threat and liberate stolen Christian wealth. The Frankish army, a perfectly organized machine thanks to his reforms, systematically located, besieged, and destroyed the Avar ring, seizing a legendary treasure so vast it filled 15 carts and effectively bankrolled Charlemagne's government and building projects for years. This immense wealth was distributed to his loyal followers, the Church, and even sent as gifts to foreign kings, a powerful demonstration of the material benefits of loyalty to the new emperor. To the south, he continued to secure his flanks, pushing the Moors back in Hispania and establishing the Spanish March, a fortified buffer zone south of the Pyrenees centered around Barcelona, finally achieving the secure frontier that had eluded him decades earlier with the tragedy of Roncesvalles. Every frontier was now hardened, not with temporary alliances, but with stone burghs, loyal garrisons, and integrated administration. Yet, the most complex and delicate frontier was not one of war, but of diplomacy, his relationship with the other Roman Empire in Constantinople. The Byzantine Empress Irene, and later Emperor Nicephorus I, were utterly horrified by Charlemagne's coronation. In their eyes, there was only one Roman Empire, and it was theirs. The Western throne had been vacant since 476, and this Frankish barbarian king, no matter how powerful, was a usurper. For years, a state of Cold War existed, with tense diplomatic negotiations and naval skirmishes in the Adriatic. Charlemagne, ever the pragmatist, knew he could not defeat the Eastern Empire outright, nor did he necessarily want to. He sought recognition. After a series of military demonstrations and shrewd diplomacy, the Byzantines, weakened by their own internal problems and facing threats from Bulgars and Arabs, were forced to acknowledge reality. In 812, ambassadors from Constantinople finally arrived at his court and addressed him as Basilius, emperor, though significantly, not as emperor of the Romans, a subtle but important distinction for them. For Charlemagne, it was enough. The Second Rome had been forced to acknowledge the first of the Franks. This recognition was the final piece of international legitimacy, cementing his status not just as a powerful Western king but as a true emperor on the world stage. His fortress of an empire was now diplomatically impregnable as well. In his final years, the relentless motion began to slow. The great architect, now an old man, spent more time at his palace in Aachen, though he never ceased governing, issuing capitularies, and sending his missi on their rounds. He oversaw the final consolidation of his laws into a coherent whole and began planning for the succession, crowning his only surviving son, Louis, as co-emperor to ensure a smooth transition of power. He had taken a fractured, warring collection of Germanic tribes and forged them into the dominant power of the West, a consciously European entity whose identity was founded on a shared Latin Christian culture, Frankish military might, and Roman imperial tradition. When he died in 814, he left behind not just an empire, but a new political idea that would haunt and inspire Europe for centuries: the vision of a unified Christendom, a commonwealth of nations under the guidance of a Christian emperor and the Church. The battle that made Charlemagne the father of Europe was indeed this entire life of relentless, calculated, and visionary labor, the building of the fortress, and the coronation was the moment the world looked upon that finished fortress and gave it its name. His legacy was the blueprint itself, a template for empire that, though his own would fracture, would never be forgotten, forever serving as a model and a reminder of what a unified Europe could be. The death of Charlemagne in 814 created a silence far more profound and unsettling than the one that had followed the retreat from Hispania decades earlier. That earlier quiet had been the tense, focused hush of a predator preparing to strike. This was the odd, bewildered stillness that follows the fall of a great mountain, leaving a void in the landscape that seems impossible to fill. The empire, this colossal creation of a single will, now had to confront its greatest test, existing without its architect. The fortress stood, its walls thick, its laws codified, its institutions humming with the efficiency he had designed, but the keystone of the entire structure, the immense, unifying force of Charlemagne's own personality and relentless attention, was gone. His son and successor, Louis, who would be known to history as Louis the Pious, was a man of a fundamentally different character, devout, thoughtful, and more inclined to settle disputes with church councils than with the swift, pragmatic justice of his father. He inherited a completed empire, but in doing so, he faced an impossible task: to be merely a manager of a system built by a genius, to maintain the relentless energy and sharp-eyed scrutiny of a superhuman effort with ordinary human hands. Almost immediately, the centrifugal forces that Charlemagne had spent his entire life suppressing through sheer force of will began to reassert themselves. The nobles, kept in perfect check by the fear and admiration of the emperor, began to test the boundaries of the new regime. The sons of Charlemagne's key administrators, who had known only the rigid discipline of his court, chafed under Louis's more pious and less martially inclined rule. The immense project of imperial unity began to show its first hairline fractures, not because it was weak, but because its central, binding pressure had been released. Louis's reign became a long, slow struggle to hold together the inheritance his father had built, not through continued expansion and iron discipline, but through religious reform and attempts to legislate unity. He issued a formal Ordinatio Imperii, a decree designed to organize the succession and prevent the empire's dissolution by naming his eldest son Lothar as co-emperor and assigning subordinate kingdoms to his younger sons, Pepin and Louis the German. This was a logical, orderly plan, but it failed to account for the ambitions of the younger sons and the powerful regional aristocracies who saw advantage in backing one brother against another. The problem was that Charlemagne's empire was not a natural organism. It was a masterpiece of political engineering, held together by the constant application of energy. Without that energy, the pieces began to pull apart. The civil wars that began late in Louis's reign and exploded after his death were not rebellions against the idea of the empire, but rather conflicts over its control, proof of how valuable the inheritance truly was. The fighting between the brothers, Lothar, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, who replaced Pepin after his death, was brutal and draining, culminating in the famous Battle of Fontenoy in 841, a bloody fratricidal clash that decimated the Frankish aristocracy and shattered the illusion of unity. The resolution came not with a reunification, but with a partition. In 843, the Treaty of Verdun formally divided the Carolingian Empire into three separate kingdoms: West Francia for Charles the Bald, which would evolve into France; East Francia for Louis the German, the kernel of what would become Germany; and a precarious, sprawling Middle Francia for Lothar, stretching from the North Sea to Italy. A kingdom with no linguistic or geographic unity that was doomed to be fought over and absorbed by its neighbors for centuries. This treaty is often seen as the death certificate of Charlemagne's empire, but in a profound way, it was also the birth certificate of modern Europe, formally etching into political reality the rough outlines of its major nation-states. Yet, to say the empire died with Verdun is to misunderstand Charlemagne's true legacy. The political structure fractured, but the cultural and intellectual foundation he had laid, the Carolingian Renaissance, proved far more durable. The standardized Latin, the clear Carolingian minuscule script, the corrected biblical texts, the network of monastic and cathedral schools, the very model of a king as a defender of the church and a promoter of learning, these did not disappear. They became the bedrock of medieval European civilization. The intellectual light kindled at his court did not flicker out. It was carried by scholars like Rabanus Maurus and others to the great monasteries of the empire, such as Fulda, Tours, and Reims, where it continued to burn, preserving and copying ancient texts and educating new generations of clergy and administrators. This preserved the dream of a unified cultural sphere, a Christianitas, even amidst political fragmentation. Furthermore, the imperial title itself, though weakened and contested, never truly vanished. It passed to rulers of Italy and then, decades later, was revived by the German King Otto the Great in 962, formally establishing the Holy Roman Empire, a political entity that would claim the mantle of Charlemagne's legacy for nearly 1,000 years, right up until the Napoleonic Wars. Every subsequent emperor, from Otto to Charles V, traced their ideological lineage back to that Christmas Day in 800, seeking to recreate, in their own time, the unity he had achieved. His ghost haunted the ambitions of Europe's greatest rulers. The memory of Charlemagne himself was quickly enveloped in legend, transforming from a historical figure into a mythic archetype. Within a few generations, the complex, pragmatic, and often ruthless architect of empire was smoothed into the figure of a perfect Christian king, a wise and mighty emperor of a golden age. This process began with his biographer, Eihard, who consciously modeled his life of Charlemagne on Suetonius's Lives of the Caesars, firmly placing him in the line of Roman emperors and emphasizing his wisdom and greatness while glossing over the more brutal aspects of his reign, like the massacre at Verdun. But the legend truly blossomed in epic poetry, most famously in the Chanson de Roland, written centuries later. In this epic, the historical defeat at Roncesvalles is completely transformed. The complex story of a rearguard wiped out due to a failed diplomatic mission and possible local betrayal becomes a soaring tragedy of heroic Christian knights betrayed by a single evil villain, Ganelon, bravely fighting against impossible odds for their emperor and their faith. In the song, Charlemagne is no longer the young, energetic king who suffered a humiliating defeat, but is portrayed as a majestic, almost supernatural ancient emperor with a long white beard, a man so powerful and close to God that he can command the sun to stand still in the sky to pursue his vengeance. This legendary Charlemagne, the idealized father of Europe, became a potent symbol throughout the Middle Ages, a model for kingship, a champion of Christendom, and a rallying point during the Crusades. The historical man, the master builder, was obscured by the myth, but the myth itself became a powerful historical force, inspiring countless acts of state building, religious fervor, and artistic creation. Therefore, the title, Father of Europe, is not bestowed because he created a political entity that lasted forever, but because he provided the essential DNA for what European civilization would become. He established the fundamental partnership between church and state that would define medieval politics. He pioneered the model of governance based on written law, administrative oversight, and cultural standardization that every successful European state would later emulate. He preserved and revived the learning of the ancient world, threading it through the needle of Christianity to create a new cultural synthesis. And perhaps most importantly, he established an enduring idea that despite its many languages and diverse peoples, Europe could conceive of itself as a single, unified civilization, a commonwealth of nations sharing a religious faith, a philosophical heritage, and a political ideal. The battle that made him was not fought in a day, but over a lifetime of immense effort. The fortress he built, though its political walls eventually crumbled, left an indelible mark on the landscape. The blueprint remained, and the dream did not die. Every attempt at European unity, from the Holy Roman Empire to the European Union, is in some way a conversation with the ghost of Charlemagne, an attempt to rediscover, in a new age, the formula for harmony and strength that he, for a glorious and formidable moment, made seem not just possible, but inevitable. His true victory was that he made Europe conscious of itself, and that self-awareness, that idea of a shared destiny and a common home, is his most lasting and powerful legacy. This self-awareness, this idea of a shared destiny that Charlemagne forged in the fires of his will, did not dissipate with the political fragmentation of his empire. Instead, it seeped deeper into the soil of Europe, becoming a latent but powerful force, a sleeping giant of an idea that would be awakened again and again throughout history by rulers, popes, and visionaries who looked upon the divided continent and saw the ghost of what it once was, and what it could be again. The centuries following the Treaty of Verdun were not a descent into pure darkness but a period where the Carolingian template was studied, adapted, and implemented on a smaller, more local scale. The kings of the successor states, West Francia, East Francia, and the messy Middle Kingdom, did not possess Charlemagne's universal authority, but they desperately wanted to. They had his methods, issuing their own capitularies, promoting learning in their own courts, and striving to present themselves as legitimate Christian rulers in the Carolingian mold. The Church, now the primary repository of administrative expertise and Latin culture, became the crucial thread of continuity, its diocesan structure and monastic networks providing a skeleton of organization that outlasted any single dynasty. Bishops and abbots, trained in the Carolingian educational system, often acted as the real administrators, the keepers of the flame of orderly governance, advising kings and managing estates with an efficiency that secular lords could not match. The very language of power, law, and faith remained the standardized Latin that Charlemagne had championed, ensuring that a scholar in Saxony could still read a legal decree written in Aquitaine, maintaining a cultural unity that stubbornly refused to be completely broken by political borders. The most direct and powerful claimant to Charlemagne's legacy was the Holy Roman Empire, established when Otto I, the powerful king of East Francia, was crowned emperor in Rome in 962. Otto consciously and deliberately set out to resurrect the Carolingian Empire. He defeated the Magyars at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, casting himself as the new defender of Christendom from Eastern invaders, just as Charles had contained the Avars. He tightened his control over the German Church, making bishops into imperial princes and key agents of his rule, a direct application of Charlemagne's policy of merging ecclesiastical and secular administration. His coronation was an explicit attempt to restart the imperial project, to plug the power of the Saxon kings into the symbolic grid that Charlemagne had built. For the next 8 centuries, the Holy Roman Empire would define the political landscape of Central Europe, its very name a declaration that it was the legitimate successor to the empire of the Caesars and the Franks. Every emperor from Otto onward had to grapple with the colossal shadow of Charlemagne. They made pilgrimages to his throne at Aachen, used his image on their seals, and invoked his name in their charters to bolster their legitimacy. He was the gold standard against which they were measured, the archetype of the Christian emperor. This was not always a comfortable legacy. It set an impossibly high bar, and the constant struggle to assert authority over a fractious nobility and an often recalcitrant papacy was a constant reminder of how much easier it had been for a figure of Charlemagne's unique force to command obedience. Beyond the political sphere, the legend of Charlemagne grew into a cultural tidal wave, particularly in France, where he was reclaimed as Charles le Magne, Charles the Great, the founding hero of the French monarchy. The Chansons de Geste, songs of heroic deeds, a cycle of epic poems of which the Chanson de Roland is the most famous, transformed the historical Frankish king into a mythic, almost messianic figure. In these poems, his wars against the Saxons and Saracens are recast as epic holy wars, a clear reflection of the crusading spirit that swept Europe from the 11th century onward. The historical complexities, the political calculations, the brutal forced conversions, the logistical marvels, were all washed away, replaced by a stark, compelling narrative of Christian knights fighting heathen hordes under the command of a wise, ancient, and godlike emperor. This literary Charlemagne became a central figure in the medieval imagination, a symbol of unwavering faith, military prowess, and imperial majesty. He was the ideal that knights were taught to aspire to, the model of kingship that popes used to exhort lazy monarchs to action. When real-world emperors like Frederick Barbarossa in the 12th century sought to expand their power, they actively encouraged the cultivation of this legend, supporting poets and artists who portrayed them as the second coming of the great Carolingian ruler. The legacy was also intellectual and artistic. The Carolingian Renaissance, though somewhat dimmed after the 9th century, had permanently altered the trajectory of Western culture. The monastic scriptoria, established and standardized under Charlemagne, continued their work for centuries, painstakingly preserving the vast majority of classical Latin literature that we have today. Without this concerted effort of copying, undertaken as a matter of imperial policy, works by Cicero, Virgil, Livy, and many others might have been lost forever in the chaos that followed the collapse of Roman authority. The Carolingian minuscule script he championed evolved into the standard medieval script and, after being rediscovered by Italian humanists during the Renaissance, became the basis for the Roman typefaces we use today on our computers, a literally tangible link between Charlemagne's reform and the modern world. The architectural style of his palace chapel at Aachen, with its Roman arches and centralized plan, became a model for later Romanesque churches across Europe, influencing the very shape of Christian worship for centuries. Therefore, to ask what battle made Charlemagne the father of Europe is to misunderstand his achievement. It was not a single event but a lifetime of relentless, multifaceted campaigning, military, administrative, legal, cultural, and religious. The battle was the daily, grinding work of building. It was fought in the drafting of a capitulary, in the instruction of a missus Dominicus, in the foundation of a school at a monastery, in the construction of a fortified burg on a lonely frontier. His genius was to understand that true, enduring power is not just about conquest but about construction, not just about winning land, but about building the institutions to hold it and the ideas to justify it. He took the shattered pieces of the post-Roman West and, through sheer force of will and brilliant organization, fused them into a new whole. He gave Europe a common project, the project of Christendom. He provided the tools, a unified law, a standardized language of faith and administration, and a model of kingship that combined temporal power with religious mission. The political empire broke apart, as all empires do, but the cultural and intellectual empire he built proved far more resilient. He planted a forest whose roots became so deep and widespread that even when the original trees fell, the forest itself remained, its ecosystem defining the landscape forever. He made Europe not a single polity, but an idea of unity amidst diversity, of shared heritage and common purpose. Every subsequent debate about European identity, every attempt at cooperation or integration, is still, in some way, happening in the cathedral he built, using the tools he forged, and measured against the memory of the emperor who, for a glorious and formidable moment, made it all seem possible. He was the architect, and we, even now, live in the world he designed. This world he designed, whose foundations were so deep they could outlast the collapse of the political structure they supported, entered a long period of dormancy after the Carolingian dynasty faded, but the blueprint was never lost. It was stored in the collective memory of the Church, in the libraries of monasteries, in the legal codes of emerging nations, and in the aspirations of every ruler who dreamed of something greater than their own petty kingdom. The idea of Europe as a unified civilization, a Respublica Christiana, became the enduring political and spiritual framework of the Middle Ages. Even as the Vikings raided, the Magyars swept in from the east, and feudal lords fractured political power into 1,000 pieces, the ideal of unity, of a common Christian world under some form of overarching order, remained the guiding star. The papacy, empowered and given a new role as a partner to empire by Charlemagne, increasingly stepped in to act as the keeper of this ideal, positioning itself as the spiritual center that could crown emperors and call for collective action, such as the Crusades, which were themselves a violent and distorted manifestation of the concept of a unified Christendom marching under a common banner against a perceived external threat. The Crusades, for all their brutality, were a profoundly European project, requiring cooperation and drawing warriors from across the continent, unimaginable without the cultural cohesion Charlemagne had initiated. The Renaissance of the 12th century, a period of intellectual and cultural revival that prefigured the better-known Italian Renaissance, was a direct flowering of the seeds planted during the Carolingian period. The network of cathedral schools, which Charlemagne had ordered established, evolved into the first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These institutions became the new engines of learning, and the curriculum they taught was based on the preserved and corrected texts of Latin antiquity, the very texts that Carolingian scribes had saved from oblivion. The scholastic method, the great intellectual innovation of the Middle Ages that sought to reconcile faith and reason, was conducted in the clear, standardized Latin that Charlemagne's reforms had solidified. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, working in the 13th century, were therefore intellectual grandchildren of the Carolingian Renaissance. They stood on the shoulders of the scholars Alcuin and Theodulf had trained. The Gothic cathedrals that began to soar towards the heavens in this period, with their intricate stonework and vast windows, were not just architectural marvels. They were statements in stone of the confidence and unity of the Christian faith, a faith that had been organized, codified, and given a political structure by the Frankish emperors centuries earlier. The legacy became more complicated with the dawn of the modern era. The Protestant Reformation of the 16th century was, in a sense, a massive rebellion against the very idea of a unified Latin Christendom that the Holy Roman Emperor was supposed to protect. Martin Luther's act of nailing his theses to the church door in Wittenberg was a rejection of the papal authority that Charlemagne had helped elevate to a position of temporal power. The ensuing wars of religion shattered the dream of a seamless Christian commonwealth, creating a Europe divided between Catholic and Protestant states. And yet, even in this fragmentation, the ghost of Charlemagne lingered. The Holy Roman Empire, though weakened and increasingly irrelevant in the face of powerful nation-states like France and Spain, persisted as a concept, a hollowed-out shell that still claimed his legacy. More importantly, the rulers of these new nation-states, from Francis I of France to Charles V of Spain, who was also Holy Roman Emperor, still looked to Charlemagne as the ultimate model of a powerful, reforming monarch. They collected Carolingian artifacts, commissioned paintings of him, and saw themselves as continuing his project of cultural patronage and strong, centralized rule, albeit within the confines of their own national borders. The very fact that these states had strong, centralized bureaucracies and codified laws was a testament to the administrative model he had pioneered. The Enlightenment and the Napoleonic Wars seemed, for a time, to finally bury the Carolingian dream. Enlightenment philosophers Voltaire famously mocked the Holy Roman Empire as being neither holy, nor Roman, nor an empire. And Napoleon Bonaparte deliberately set out to destroy it, seeing himself as a new, modern conqueror who would replace the ancient feudal structure with a rational, secular system of his own making. And yet, in a breathtaking act of historical irony, Napoleon was himself the most powerful and direct inheritor of Charlemagne's legacy. He crowned himself Emperor of the French in 1804 in a ceremony meticulously staged to echo Charlemagne's coronation. He traveled to Aachen to pay homage at Charlemagne's throne. He sought to create a new continental system, a unified European economic bloc under French control, which was a stark, secularized mirror of Charlemagne's Christian empire. He even named his son and heir the King of Rome, a title dripping with Carolingian and imperial symbolism. In trying to destroy the old order, Napoleon was unconsciously acknowledging its power and replicating its form. He proved that the idea of a unified Europe, led by a single powerful emperor-like figure, remained a potent political temptation long after the original empire had turned to dust. The 19th and 20th centuries saw the full emergence of the nation-state, a concept that seemed the absolute antithesis of Charlemagne's universal empire. Nationalists in Germany, France, and Italy all fought to claim his legacy for themselves. The French pointed to his spoken language, a Romance dialect, and his capital at Aachen, on their border, to claim him as a proto-French king. The Germans emphasized his Saxon wars and his rule over German-speaking lands to claim him as a German hero. This competition over his memory reached its horrific climax in the two world wars, which were essentially civil wars within the space he had once unified, fought with industrial brutality by nation-states that were the fragmented and often antagonistic descendants of his realm. The sheer destruction of these conflicts, culminating in the Holocaust, discredited the extreme nationalist ideologies and forced Europeans to once again look for a model of cooperation and unity to prevent future carnage. And what model did they turn to? Not that of Napoleon's forced conquest, but that of a voluntary, peaceful union based on shared economic interests, common laws, and a commitment to peace, a structure that, in its own modern, democratic way, echoed the Carolingian project of building unity through shared rules, standardized laws, now EU regulations, and the free movement of people and goods across once bloodied borders. The European Union, with its capital in Brussels, situated squarely in the heart of the old Carolingian core, is the latest and most peaceful iteration of the ancient dream. The euro currency, used across much of the continent, features bridges and arches on its banknotes, symbols of connection, and is a direct descendant of Charlemagne's standardization of weights, measures, and coinage. When the EU's founding fathers, like Robert Schuman, spoke of a united Europe, they were, whether consciously or not, invoking a vision that had first been made real over 1,000 years earlier. Thus, the journey from the palace at Aachen to the institutions of Brussels is a long and winding one, but the connection is undeniable. Charlemagne's battle was not for a single patch of land or a momentary victory. It was to implant an idea into the consciousness of a continent. That idea, that diverse peoples could be united under a common system of law, a common cultural project, and a sense of shared destiny, has proven to be one of the most resilient and powerful forces in history. It has been twisted, fought over, forgotten, and rediscovered, but it has never truly died. He is the father of Europe not because he ruled all of it, but because he was the first to conceive of it as a single, coherent entity worthy of a name and a purpose. Every time a student learns from a standardized text, every time a court rules based on a codified law, every time a traveler crosses a European border without a passport, and every time leaders meet in Strasbourg or Brussels to debate their common future, they are, in a small way, living in the world that Charlemagne built. The fortress of the soul he constructed did not crumble. It evolved, and its gates remain open, inviting each new generation to continue the work of building a more perfect union. The echo of the hammers on the stone at Aachen has never truly faded. It has simply changed its rhythm, becoming the sound of a continent forever striving to become what he first dared to imagine it could be. This eternal striving, this constant, often contentious, dialogue between unity and division, is the true inheritance of Charlemagne, the restless spirit he bequeathed to the continent. The modern European project, for all its bureaucratic complexity and political challenges, is the latest chapter in this long story, an attempt to achieve through voluntary agreement and economic interdependence what he achieved through iron will and military force. The EU's very struggles, the tension between national sovereignty and supranational authority, the debates over a common foreign policy, the pain of integrating economies at different levels of development, are ancient Carolingian problems playing out on a democratic stage. They are the same challenges he faced when trying to bind Saxony to Aquitaine, or Italy to Bavaria: how to create common rules for vastly different cultures, how to ensure loyalty to a central idea while respecting local traditions, how to make the whole stronger than the sum of its parts. The EU's principle of subsidiarity, which holds that decisions should be made at the most local level possible, is a modern, democratic echo of Charlemagne's constant travel through his realms, his attempt to govern not from a distant capital but by being present, inspecting, and understanding local realities firsthand. Even the technocratic nature of the EU, often criticized as being distant from its citizens, finds a strange precursor in Charlemagne's reliance on his teams of expert missi dominici and literate clerics, a governance by trained administrators rather than solely by feudal loyalty. The cultural legacy is even more profound and pervasive. The very concept of Western civilization, as a taught subject, a tradition that encompasses the philosophical heritage of Greece and Rome, the religious tradition of Judaism and Christianity, and the legal and political innovations of medieval and modern Europe, is a direct construct of the Carolingian Renaissance. Before Charlemagne, these threads were separate and fraying. His project of cultural salvage and synthesis wove them into a single, identifiable tapestry. The university system, the foundation of higher learning in the West, grew from the cathedral and monastic schools he mandated. The scientific revolution, though it would later challenge church doctrine, depended on the preservation of ancient texts and the culture of scholarship that Carolingian monasteries diligently maintained. Figures like Copernicus and Galileo stood on a pyramid of knowledge whose base was built by anonymous scribes in scriptoria at Tours or Fulda, copying Ptolemy and Aristotle because an emperor had ordered it. The humanist scholars of the Renaissance, who rediscovered the full glory of classical antiquity, were able to do so because the Carolingian scholars had already done the essential work of preservation, creating the libraries that the Italians would later plunder for inspiration. The Carolingian minuscule script they used became the model for the Roman typeface, meaning that the letters you are reading right now are a direct evolution of the writing standard enforced by Charlemagne's chancery. His reform literally shaped how we see words on a page. In the realm of law and governance, his impact is equally fundamental. The modern continental European legal tradition, based on comprehensive civil codes, like the Napoleonic Code or the German BGB, owes a deep, often unacknowledged debt to the Carolingian capitularies. Charlemagne's attempt to create a unified, written legal system for his entire empire, to replace disparate tribal customs with a standard set of rules, was a radical innovation. It established the principle that law should be rational, written, and applicable to all, a principle that would be rediscovered and amplified centuries later, and would form the bedrock of the modern European state. The very idea of a professional administrative class, a civil service, finds an early model in the counts, bishops, and missi who were accountable not just through personal loyalty but to a written set of instructions and laws. This concept of impersonal, institutional governance is a cornerstone of the modern world, and its roots dig deep into the soil of the Carolingian Empire. Yet, perhaps the most fascinating aspect of his legacy is how it has been weaponized, reinterpreted, and claimed by opposing ideologies. For centuries, he was the ultimate symbol of Christian monarchy. In the 19th century, he became a nationalist icon, claimed by both France and Germany. His image used to stoke the very nationalistic rivalries that would tear the continent apart.